I can't actually believe this is real. We are in 2026 and people still believe that the Shroud of Turin is a literal receipt from God. I can't. And not only do people believe it, but they are actively spreading lies about the Shroud of Turin. And I know because I went to the Shroud Encounter. Today, to very belatedly celebrate this Easter season, we are going to unpack the absolutely wild claims that were made at this event, which unfortunately were just eaten up by the crowd. Let's talk about it. Welcome to the Common Sense Cult, where we unravel Christian thinking, criticize indoctrination, and dissect apologetics. Today we're going to do a bit of all three as we dissect the renowned Shroud of Turin. Now, I have to preface this by saying that even as a devout Christian, someone who wholeheartedly, fully believed in the resurrection, and I believed in the resurrection up until the absolute end of my deconstruction, so it was the last thing that I let go of. But as someone who believed in all of that, I never really believed the validity of the Shroud of Turin. Most likely because it was displayed by the Catholic Church, and I strongly rejected the veneration of images of God, as a good old Protestant does. So I never really paid it much attention, and I have been absolutely shocked, gobsmacked, flabbergasted to see so many people comment on my videos on social media and on YouTube saying that the Shroud of Turin is physical evidence of the resurrection. There is no evidence for the resurrection, by the way. All we have is hearsay and beliefs documented decades after the event by people who never even knew Jesus. This is not evidence. It's evidence of belief, not of the resurrection, but I digress. All of these comments about the Shroud of Turin that I've been receiving have pushed me to investigate the Shroud because I honestly thought I must be missing something if so many people think it was legit. Turns out I was not missing anything. It's the same old apologetics trick of twisting the truth to push a specific narrative. So today we're going to explore exactly what these half-truths are that are being pushed and why they are so inaccurate. Now, I had the chance to hear the Shroud of Turin expert speak on the matter. And I'm going to share audio from that presentation. It's not going to be the full thing because we'd be here forever. But I will link the transcript in the description below if you are so inclined to read it. But it was free and open to the public, so I recorded the audio and I'm going to share it with you guys. The presenter was Russ Perrault. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, but he is the founder of The Shroud Encounter and is an author, speaker, educator, and international expert. He has appeared on the History Channel, CBS, ABC News, etc. He is apparently a very big name when it comes to the Shroud of Turin. Like when I say the expert on the matter, I'm talking about the absolute expert on the matter. I now realize after listening to his presentation that is probably a self-proclaimed title. He's not actually an expert on the Shroud besides using it to push a specific narrative about Christianity and Christian beliefs. Oh, look, his own mission statement is about indoctrinating children. Oops, sorry. That says to advance the knowledge of the Shroud to a new generation. Same thing. To give you an idea of what the presentation was like, because I'm going to share some of the visuals, but not all the ones that he had. But I want to show you this very outdated clip teaser of what people actually pay him to present.
Could an ancient Jewish linen cloth be the actual burial shroud of Jesus? Could the Shroud of Turin be a document of the crucifixion? Is that even possible? Or is it nothing more than a medieval hoax? For hundreds of years, this ancient linen cloth, etched with the faint image of a crucified man, has mystified millions. It continues to speak from centuries past, challenging us to unlock its many secrets. Nearly every scientific regimen has been employed to unravel the mystery, and yet it remains unsolved. Shroud Encounter is a dramatic big-screen experience. Each clue is revealed and examined like a CSI investigation, leading deeper into its maze of mystery and intrigue. Explore this profound enigma with Russ Perrault, one of the world's leading experts, captivating audiences from coast to coast and featured in numerous documentaries seen on History Channel, Discovery, and CBS. Don't miss Shroud Encounter.
Anyways, I went into this presentation expecting some very top-notch research and unbiased analysis. I mean, if you're going to call yourself an expert on something, I do expect unbiased analysis and critique. And even the introduction that he gave for his own presentation really hyped me up for it.
And here we are, we live in a skeptical age, we live in a scientific age. We scratch our heads and we say, really? Is that even possible? Is that even remotely possible that the burial shroud of Jesus still exists and sitting in a medium-sized church right now in northern Italy? Well, that's what we're going to explore. We're going to review the science. We're going to follow the historical trail. We're going to analyze. We're going to examine the body. We're going to analyze the blood. We're going to consider what caused the image. Another name for this presentation is CSI Jerusalem, the case of the missing body.
Fantastic. CSI level investigation? Hell yeah, I'm in. Let's see what you have for us, Russ.
You know, circa first century, no one ever contested the empty tomb.
Are you kidding me? Right off the bat, we have an incredibly vast overstatement. I mean, he literally just said that we were going to do CSI Jerusalem, follow the historical trail. How can you say such a historically inaccurate statement to start? Let's review. The earliest documents that we have after Jesus' death do not even mention a tomb. I am, of course, referring to Paul's letters, you know, the ones that were written around the 50s AD. There is not one mention of a tomb. Not one. Even the pre-Pauline creed that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15 says that Jesus died for our sins in accordance to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day. That word buried in the Greek is not exclusive to a tomb burial. It literally can refer to any type of burial. That could refer to a mass grave, which was very common for crucifixion victims, or it could refer to just a simple grave in the ground or a tomb. It was not specific to a tomb. Just because it says buried does not mean that there had to be a tomb. But anyways, the emphasis that modern Christians have of the empty tomb, you know, all of the imagery that comes with Easter of an empty tomb, that just simply isn't in the earliest Christian text that we have. And there's not one mention of a tomb in Paul's letters, not one. And I mean, most likely because, you know, as I said, crucifixion victims were either thrown in a mass grave or they were left on the cross to be eaten, because that was a core part of the humiliation aspect of crucifixion. So would it have been probable that someone who was crucified for treason by the Roman Empire to be given a proper tomb burial? Probably not. I mean, it's possible, yes, but likely? No, it's highly unlikely. So because there are no mentions of the tomb in the earliest Christian records, and because of the extensive documentation that we have of how Romans treated crucifixion victims and what they did with the body, how they disposed of them, you know, not in tombs, many scholars posit that this tomb narrative was made up over time. So the idea that Russ is starting this whole presentation with, that nobody ever contested the empty tomb, completely just jumps over the fact that a tomb wasn't even mentioned in the earliest texts. It's not that it wasn't contested, it wasn't even mentioned. It wasn't mentioned until Mark, which was written about 40 years after Jesus' death. And 40 years is plenty of time for a story to develop, for legends to evolve, and for myths to, you know, change over time. Completely enough time. And you know, Russ, with this whole CSI Jerusalem take, he's ignoring the very real possibility of the tomb being a narrative addition. And on top of that, he's ignoring extensive historical evidence we have to the contrary, that people were almost never put into tombs. We have one example out of the thousands that were crucified, and it is highly improbable that Jesus was placed into a tomb. But we're ignoring all of that evidence, and instead he's playing on people's pre-established beliefs to confirm what is not actually fact. But let's, for the sake of argument, say that there was a tomb. The fact that Russ is saying that it was never contested is still a vast overstatement. Just because the few gospels that we actually have today don't contest the empty tomb doesn't mean that nobody ever contested the empty tomb in the first century. That is an argument from silence, and an argument from silence is a fallacy, Russ. Starting your presentation by skipping over historical evidence and over representing your personal beliefs, And also including a fallacy is not a great way to start, Russ. Just a tip for you there, historical international expert. Definitely not CSI worthy.
The tomb was clearly empty. For those people who couldn't wrap their heads around a resurrection, they simply assumed that the body was stolen or something.
Again, this is only drawing from the gospel narratives that were written decades after the death of Jesus and by people who never knew Jesus. Again, there is no clearly about this. You can't say that the tomb was clearly empty for the people there. That doesn't exist. There is no clearly anything in antiquities. Saying an event in antiquity is clear is incredibly misleading and a misrepresentation of what historians actually investigate. Again, Russ, tracing the historical trail, as you put it, is not this.
Wait a minute. What if the scriptures are true? What if Jesus really did rise again on the third day, as the scriptures say? Then does this cloth provide clues as to what happened to the body? It really is the case of the missing body.
I mean, these are really big what ifs. We're jumping straight into a miraculous explanation and ignoring a myriad of more probable explanations as to what happened. Again, this is not really what happens in a CSI episode, but also, it's not really the case of the missing body. I know that sounds cool, but that's not really accurate. Archaeologists might have uncovered the body of Jesus and just not known it because, we don't have DNA evidence for Jesus. We can't compare it to anything. And even if we do call it a missing body, then we're going to have a bunch of cases of CSI missing body because there were thousands of other crucifixion victims that had the same thing happen to them. Now, after this introduction that he gave, Russ went into detail about the shroud and how it shows the injuries that align with a crucified victim, specifically Jesus.
Now, anytime you look at a book or a magazine or Google the shroud, you always see the face image. You sometimes see this full frontal image. What you almost never see is the fact.
Correction there. Not a fact. Okay, this is not a fact. This is an educated conclusion, not a fact.
That this is a front and back image of about a 5'10" crucified man. And so here we see scrapes and blood flows all around the back of the head from an apparent crown of thorns.
Sorry, I have to pause again. We're just glossing over the fact that this is a man that was 5'10". Okay, that is almost 6 feet. Based on archaeological evidence, do you know what the average height for a Jewish man from the first century was? Do you think it was near 6 feet? No, of course not. It was 5'1" to 5'5". What is that in centimeters? That's like 150 to 160, 165? I don't know. Something around there. But either way, 5'10" would make Jesus an abnormally tall man for the time. Now, I'm just going to throw this out there, but do you know what the average height for skeletons from medieval Europe was? 5'5" to 5'7". A bit closer to 5'10". So it would be more likely to, if it was an actual person, to be a medieval man rather than a extremely tall first century Jewish man. Just saying. But also artistically speaking, if this was an artist's rendition of Jesus, it would make sense to make him, taller than the average man because it is a holy figure. But for this shroud to be from the actual body of Jesus, that would make Jesus almost like a giant walking among his people. And I just find that image very funny because I always imagine him to be a very average Jewish man. He was a carpenter. He wasn't anyone that stood out, but 5'10", I mean, I'm 5'2", so I would fit in among the average height of people during that time, and then someone 5'10" is significantly taller, and I can't get over the fact that we're just glossing over that fact that this would be a very giant first century Jewish man.
We see scourge marks crisscrossing the back on two directions. Scourge marks go from the base of the neck all the way down to the ankles. Over 120 scourge marks or whip marks can be counted. We see blood across the small of the back here from that side wound. We see the back of the left leg with the bottom of the left foot planted firmly against the cloth with apparently 2 exit wounds for 2 nails. And you see blood trailing off from this upper wound. We see the back of the right leg somewhat elevated above the left leg with the bottom of the right heel as if one foot was placed upon the other. Could this be the image of Jesus?
Or, just hear me out, could this be a recreation of what the cloth might have been, specifically making the injuries appear like what we see in the Bible? Just an idea that I'm throwing out there.
Well, if you're going to ask that question, you're going to have to start with Scripture.
No, again, this is a horrible place to start. While the Bible contains some of the only contemporary mentions of Jesus, and yes, it would be applicable in this discussion of the history of the historical trail of the Shroud of Turin, it is not a wholly reliable source to start with. We have to consider the very heavy religious elements and theological themes that make this historical text less reliable than other non-religious texts. Like, these are some of the things that historians use to analyze what is a reliable and non-reliable source. And because the Gospels have such heavy religious theological elements, that does lessen their reliability in situations like this, like a resurrection. And then we also have to consider the disconnect that the authors had with Jesus. We're talking decades after his death by people who never even knew him. So why would we start with these texts? I mean, if we were actually following the historical trail, as Russ said, and investigating whether the shroud could actually be from Jesus, why wouldn't we start with historical records of crucifixion methods and burial methods? And even like I said with the skeletons and the height, does this body even look like it could be a man from first century Judea? Or maybe we could look into the history of medieval relics and artistic techniques of those times, considering this has been declared a relic and not the actual shroud of Jesus, since, you know, it was first mentioned in medieval times. Like, there are so many more logical, better historical places to start with than the Bible. And I mean, I get that Christians believe that the Bible is the inspired and true word of God. I get that. I was there. I totally understand. But then you can't compare your supposed investigation into the legitimacy of the shroud to a CSI episode. Well, I mean, actually, both have heavy elements of fiction. So you know what, Russ, you might be onto something with that. But let's hear what Russ says. What does the Bible have to say?
So what does the Scripture say? Joseph of Arimathea bought a long sheet of linen cloth, and taking Jesus' body down from the cross, he wrapped it in the cloth and laid it in a tomb that had been carved out of the rock. So what do we know?
Well, before you go on, Russ, we don't know anything. Just because this story says something doesn't mean it actually happened. That word "know" is very heavy there.
Now we know that Joseph of Arimathea is the man who purchased the linen shroud. He's the same man who owned the tomb in which Jesus would be laid to rest. So now we know Jesus was wrapped in some kind of a linen shroud.
Again, that word "know" there is doing a lot of work. We don't know any of this for a fact. You're making a lot of massive assumptions here. But this Joseph of Arimathea story. This is another example of a narrative element that was likely added into the story later to give it more credibility, just like the tomb. We can see just from the development of the earliest to the latest Gospels, you know, from Mark to John, how Joseph of Arimathea changed from a member of the council in Mark to disagreeing with the council's decision in Luke, to then become a secret follower of Jesus in John. Joseph of Arimathea is a perfect example of legendary development and how stories and texts change over time. But even still, it's contradictory within the Gospels because the council unanimously agreed to condemn Jesus. But then Joseph of Arimathea was on that council and then somehow disagreed, but the vote was still unanimous. And then immediately afterwards, he went to Rome to ask for the body and then gave him his own tomb. Like, it doesn't make sense. Was there a unanimous decision, or was there a dissenter among them who then went behind their backs? Like, why would he unanimously say, yes, let's condemn Jesus, then immediately turn around and say, oh no, give me the body, I want to put it in my tomb? This doesn't make sense even within the Gospels. And that's, again, another reason why many historians posit that this is a legendary development, because the story across the gospel changes and it often contradicts. Not to mention how difficult it would have been to convince the Romans to lower down the body of a person convicted of crimes against the empire. Because, like I said, humiliation was a major aspect of crucifixion. People who committed crimes against the Roman Empire were meant to stay up on that cross and be humiliated as they died, as their bodies were eaten. That was the point. So to convince the Roman Empire to say, no, I want that body taken down, please. Yeah, that would have been highly unlikely. So just like how the idea of the tomb wasn't in the earliest Christian texts, the idea of someone trying to bury Jesus instead of just leaving his body up on the cross or being thrown into a mass grave, it seems to have been purposely invented, and it likely serves several different purposes, and I'm going to list 3 of them briefly because I want to get back into the presentation. But this is important because this story is one of the major things that apologists and Christians go to as proof that Jesus was actually buried. So, first of all, the story development of Joseph of Arimathea, it serves to fulfill prophecy. So we see numerous places in the Gospels where the authors try and retroactively interpret scripture to emphasize that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. And we see this often in Matthew, where the author says things like, "This was to fill what was spoken by the prophet." And so having a grave from a rich person like Joseph of Arimathea could be invented to align with scriptures like Isaiah 53:9, which says he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. And so he died a criminal's death, and then he was laid to rest in a rich man's tomb. So you see the parallel there. Number 2, it gives Jesus, who was seen as a sort of hero, the Messiah, it gives him an honorable burial. You don't want the hero of your story to end up being eaten by birds or other scavengers. You want them to have a respectable burial. If there was a bodily resurrection, as they said, you won't resurrect a body that was eaten by scavengers. That would be terrifying. So a donated tomb from a rich benefactor looks so much better for the hero of your story. And again, like the prophecies, this idea of a rich traditional burial aligns with motifs throughout the Old Testament of righteous burials. And it just fits the cultural expectations much better. And number 3, the story of Joseph of Arimathea helps smooth over some political tensions. So as we go through the Gospels from Mark to John, we see a clear progression of moving away from blaming the Romans for Jesus' death to blaming the Jews. And this shift in blame has worked so much that today so many Christians say that the Romans didn't kill Jesus and that it was actually Jews. But by having Joseph of Arimathea be a dissenting voice on the Sanhedrin, that shows that not all the Jews were against Jesus. And so it's kind of a way to say, oh, the Jews, they killed him, but not everybody agreed. So it's kind of a way to place it both sides and then potentially also gain Jewish converts. And again, I know a lot of that strays a bit from the Shroud of Turin specifically and its legitimacy, but I think these are extremely important points because when Russ uses elements from the Bible that are likely embellished narrative elements or legendary developments as facts, we just have to point them out because right now he's trying to lay a foundation before we even get to discussion of the shroud, of how it does align with the Bible and how Jesus was buried. And these aren't facts, and I just have to call them out. We don't know if Joseph of Arimathea was actually real. We don't even know if Arimathea was a real place. That's a super important point here. We don't know if there was a tomb, and all of that needs to be considered before we talk about the shroud that Jesus was allegedly buried in. But anyways, all that to point out that the alleged historical foundation that Russ is trying to build is very, very flimsy.
Well, how many of you know that Jesus was Jewish? Raise your hands if you know that he's Jewish, because I think a lot of people think he was Italian or something.
Who has ever said that Jesus was Italian? Although I do have to agree that I think that a lot of modern day Christians don't realize that Jesus was Jewish.
You have to look at Jewish burial practices, and the Jewish tradition recognizes the democracy of death. It therefore will demand that all Jews be buried in the same type of garment, a simple white shroud. So, get out of your mind any notion that the Jews
Good.
wound their bodies with strips of linen like some kind of mummy. No, that's an Egyptian thing. That's not a Jewish thing. But the scriptures are confusing. So I'm going to put up all four gospels, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
We're doing so well. We were actually digging into some historical elements that I said that we should talk about if we're going to go down the historical trail, talking about Jewish tradition and burial methods. We were doing well. And now we're going backwards again. I would love to see sources for Jewish burial practices that aren't from the Bible. That's what I would have expected, from a international expert on the Shroud, to go back into Jewish burial practices and talk about it and explore, and not just look at the Bible. I would love to see a bunch of examples, and include the Bible, yes, of course. But not just the Bible. It's not the only source, guys. Okay? Again, I understand that Christians believe that this is the word of God. I get it, but that is not proper historical analysis. The Gospels are not the only sources we have. Newsflash, sorry. But yeah, we could have even looked at Josephus. That's a source that Christian apologists love to use. We could have looked at what he has to say about burial practices from the 1st century. And he was writing right around the time that the Gospels were written, actually, so that would have been a great source to pull from. But just using the Bible is biased, to say the least. But still, I want to go over the verses that he uses, because the Shroud of Turin does not align with all the verses in the Bible about Jesus' burial. And I want to highlight what verses Russ uses, and then I'm going to highlight what he's skipping conveniently. Okay?
John 19:40 also says he was bound and skipped. Matthew says he was wrapped in a clean linen cloth. Luke says he wrapped the body in linen. Mark says, and then he bought fine linen and took it down and wrapped them in the linen. Only John mentions strips, and not in all the translations.
Sorry, I have to stop again here. We're going to get to what he's missing. But he is just weaving in so many little twists and manipulations that we have to point some of them out, okay? So he says only John mentions strips and not in all translations. And I have to flag this because he is going to come back to an alleged translation later as if it were evidence. And I have to say that translations are not evidence. It doesn't really matter if some translations don't say strips in plural in John. It matters what was actually written in the original Greek. That's what matters here. And the word that was written in the original Greek, it is plural. So yes, John actually says strips. You can't just brush that off by saying, well, some translations don't translate it that way. No.
So how are we going to reconcile this apparent contradiction?
Well, you're already trying to do so in a very manipulative way by not being completely honest about the full contradictions in the first place. But let's listen and see how he tries to reconcile them.
Now, how many remember the big miracle that occurred right before they determined that Jesus had to die? What miracle was that? Lazarus. This was the monster miracle. Lazarus come forth, and out walks Lazarus wearing his grave clothes, bound hand and foot. And so what's the logical synthesis is you have strips of linen binding the wrists, binding the ankles, binding the chin with a single linen shroud wrapping the body, which would be especially true in the event of violent death with significant loss of blood.
Yep, you heard that correctly. He's trying to explain away contradictions in whether Jesus was laid in a linen cloth or in strips of cloth by using the Bible itself. So we have contradictions in the Bible. We're using the Bible to explain those contradictions. And then not just any part of the Bible, but the same book that has the alleged contradiction. And not just any part of that book, but another miraculous event. So we're trying to prove a miraculous event and explain away contradictions in the miraculous event with another miraculous event that is also not proven. This is not how historical analysis works. And as far as I can tell from my extremely basic research that I did on ancient Jewish burial customs, it was not customary to bind the limbs. I may be wrong about that, but again, I tried to look into it and it wasn't common from what I could tell. And even if we say, let's grant the fact that Jesus could have been bound by the wrists and the feet, let's say that happened. Let's say that that's why the author of John used strips of linen cloth, plural, because he was bound hand and foot. Let's grant that. Why don't we see that on the Shroud of Turin? If that were true, we wouldn't have such clear impressions of the body. There would have been smudges at the wrist. There would have been smudges at the ankles. There would have been something marking that there was another layer of cloth there. It wouldn't have just been, he's going to say it was from light. The light wouldn't have made the imprint equally throughout the whole body if there are other layers here. We would have seen it on the impression if that were true. But that seemingly just never occurred to him in his very poor attempt to consolidate these contradictory texts in a medieval relic.
There's no washing of the body, no removal of the clothes. You're wrapped in a single shroud and in the ground that day. And that's what we see on the shroud. So everything seems to be consistent with the gospel accounts.
No. It does not line up with Jewish tradition. As I said, it wasn't customary to bind their limbs. And no, it does not seem to be consistent either with the Bible. But he specifically said there's no washing of the body. And that's important because it would have removed some of the wounds that we can allegedly see on the Shroud of Turin, right? But what the book of John says is that they bound the body in linen cloths in spices. About 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes were put on the body of Jesus. 75 pounds. Just think about that. You're not using water to wash away the wounds, but you're putting a massive amount of spices. And I'm sure there's some liquid in that, like aloes. It's not water, but it's some type of liquid that you spread on the body. It's going to make an image of the body blurry. If that were laid on the body, we would have seen that on the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin does not line up with everything in the Bible, especially the book of John. It is very contradictory to the book of John. And that's not even mentioning what John 27 says, which, of course, Russ conveniently skips over, mind you. He instead focuses on the reaction of the people that went to the tomb and skips over verse 7. So listen to this.
Now, this is from John chapter 20, verses 1 through 9. Early Sunday morning, while it was still dark, and Jesus peeks in, sees that the body's gone, and runs to find the apostles. This verse goes on. We, meaning Peter and John, we ran to the tomb to see. I outran Peter and got there first, and stooped and looked in and saw the linen clothes lying there, but I didn't go in.
So he completely ignores the fact that the verse says the linens and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. A face cloth, a separate cloth for the face. The Shroud of Turin is one giant piece that goes front to back. There is not a separate face cloth. This verse that he, of course, skipped over, of course, because it doesn't fit his narrative, we have to keep this in mind. This verse directly contradicts the Shroud of Turin. Directly contradicts. Now, am I saying that John is absolute truth? No, of course not. But what I am saying is that Christians who claim that the Shroud of Turin is legit are often the same people who are claiming that the Bible is the literal word of God and absolute truth. But these two contradict. You can't have both of them.
And one thing that's not mentioned in Scripture is any direct reference to Jesus leaving his image on his burial shroud.
Correct. Maybe just maybe. That's because, one, there wasn't an actual tomb and burial cloths to be collected, so making a claim like that would have been ridiculous without proof to actually back it up. And two, because the shroud was made in medieval times. I don't know. Just throwing that idea out there.
Now, there's a reason for that. Is because, when were the Gospels written? 20 to 30 years after the events in question.
20 to 30 years? 20 to 30 years? Please. More like 35 to 70 years. Oh, man.
What was happening 20 to 30 years later? Well, they killed James in 44. They tried to kill Peter, but he was rescued by an angel.
Again, trying to defend a supposed miraculous event with other miraculous events like an angel intervening. And again, both of these stories are from the book of Acts, which many historians consider to be historically unreliable. So historical trail. This is not a historical trail. This is a Christian theological trail that we're exploring because, yeah, this no, this doesn't stand up to historical analysis. Not that I'm a historian, but from what I understand, this is not stand up.
Persecution was in high swing. You're not going to broadcast that the fact that you have this cloth. So it's not unreasonable that the Gospels are silent.
I don't know. It's not unreasonable to think that the Gospels are silent about it because it didn't exist. But also, if the apostles were being persecuted as much as Christians like to think that they were, what difference would a cloth make? I don't get it. In fact, I think the opposite would be true. If they had a cloth with the face of Jesus on it, I mean, even if it was a stain from something else and they claimed it was the face of Jesus, I mean, it probably would be very helpful in converting people. I mean, just take Paul, for example. Very bold, very vocal. He wasn't going to suddenly hide a piece of evidence for his faith just because he was afraid of potential consequences. That's not very Paul-like. Come on. We're talking about people who, like, went out, caused disturbances, were vocal about their beliefs. And a cloth? They're scared about a cloth, about what a cloth would do when they're already facing imprisonment and death? Come on, that's a ridiculous argument.
However, let's so Constantine legalizes Christianity in 311 with the Edicts of Toleration. Let's go a little bit past that, and we'll get to what's called the Mozarabic Rite of Holy Week. This is liturgy that is brought to Spain by a group of Arab Catholics, and they translate John chapter 20, verses 5 and 6. We just read it.
Quick note here. What he's going to reference is not a translation. I told you. Just wait for the second time he uses translation. It's right here. This is not a translation. This is not some new translation of the Greek New Testament. Like he said, this is liturgy. This is a liturgical devotional rendering that interprets the resurrection story more symbolically. This is not a translation.
This is how they translate it. Peter ran with John to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. Well, now that's interesting. That's not in your
Really
translation of the Bible, but that's how they chose to translate these verses. Why would they do that? Unless it was based on something that they had seen or something that they had heard or maybe passed down through oral tradition.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe because it's not an actual translation of the text, because it's meant as a devotional, because the word vestigium, which is the imprint on the linens, it doesn't necessarily mean a photographic like image as what we see on the shroud. I mean, again, using a supposed translation, not even an actual translation, but using a supposed translation as more authentic than the original text is crazy work. Not only is he essentially saying that the Bible that he believes to be the inspired word of God is inaccurate and incomplete, but he's also conflating a liturgical rite from much later Christian traditions with first century texts. I mean, from a Christian standpoint, this is some dangerous work. It's like saying a devotional that someone wrote hundreds and thousands of years later is somehow more accurate than the Bible, and that it somehow contains information that is missing from the Bible. That's borderline heretical, blasphemous. And then from a historical standpoint, I just don't see how this liturgical rite is relevant at all. It is more symbolic than anything. It's not a reference to a physical piece of cloth with the image of Jesus. And it comes out almost 1,000 years after Jesus was killed and the Gospels were written. I mean, 1,000 years, almost a full millennia. And now we're talking about some imprints on a cloth and somehow that's historically accurate. I just don't get it. And still, we're even 400 or 500 years before the first mentions of the Shroud of Turin. Like, he's literally going through and pulling out whatever he can find to support this idea that the Shroud of Turin is legit. There is nothing that connects it, this liturgical rite, to the actual Gospels, considering the time and the influence in this liturgical rite. And it's so far before the Shroud of Turin was even mentioned. Like, this has nothing to do with the Shroud of Turin. He's literally picking it because it might possibly be interpreted as that. Cherry picking. He is cherry picking, guys.
I mean, think about it. We're still looking for Noah's Ark. Haven't found it yet. Maybe sightings, I suppose, but hasn't been excavated as far as I know. Still looking for the Ark of the Covenant, the box that contained the stone tablets. Haven't found that yet either. Yet the burial shroud that has wrapped the crucified and risen Son of God could be sitting in a medium-sized church right now in northern Italy, and the world at large barely knows about it.
It seems like he hasn't heard of Ron Wyatt and all the things that he discovered. But again, why bring up all of these fantastical items when, again, doing a program and event essentially called CSI Jerusalem? It's like mentioning that, well, we haven't found Poseidon's trident yet. We haven't found Thor's hammer yet. So this could also be the miraculous shroud of Jesus who resurrected. We're talking on the same level here. This is crazy.
You see, no matter how much science we apply to the shroud, we can never prove it absolutely to be, in fact, the burial shroud of Jesus. We can't do it. You know why? Because we don't have the DNA of Jesus to match it up with anything we might extract from the shroud.
I mean, exactly this. We can't prove it to be from Jesus. Period. We don't have Jesus' DNA to compare it to anything. This is right. We should have started here, ended here. That's pretty much it.
But here's what we can do. We can prove what it's not.
I mean, yes, this makes sense logically, but the issue is that none of the evidence that he will go on to produce proves that it's not an artist's work. He misrepresents data, ignores other plausible options, and heavily implies that a miraculous conclusion is the most logical. This is a textbook example of arguing from ignorance and confirmation bias. We're going to go through some of his alleged evidence, and I'll provide examples of things that he overlooks or misinterprets or misrepresents. And keep in mind that the miraculous is almost never the most logical conclusion, especially when we're talking about antiquities and we have stories of the miraculous all the time. Accepting the miraculous is not the most probable and oftentimes nor the most logical conclusion here. Is it possible? Yes, but it defies everything that we know about the natural world. So I'm not saying that it's not an option, but we would need to have overwhelming evidence that this is the most logical conclusion. But instead, what we're going to do is show that we have a lack of evidence and then just stick a label on it and call it miracle of the resurrection to explain our gap in knowledge.
The shroud poses a really, really important either-or proposition. And that's this. Either the Shroud of Turin is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus, or it's not. And if it's not, then what is it? If it's not authentic, then it must be the work of an artist, or it must be the work of human effort somehow, some way.
Now, here's a crazy idea. I think the shroud is authentic. Not authentically the shroud that Jesus was buried in, but an authentic medieval creation made by humans. And the rest then goes on to talk about the large Shroud of Turin research project that went in 1978 to do research on the shroud in Italy. And I am summarizing here because he went on and on about how impressive it was, how many people went. You can read the Wikipedia page if you're interested. But he just inflates it a lot and misrepresents the data. So we're going to jump in here.
And so you got to think about this. 5 days and nights, 120 hours. All this gear, it can't possibly be that hard to figure out whether something's the work of an artist or not. But apparently it is, because here's the quote from Tom Dumahalle, who was a nuclear physicist. We all thought we'd find it was a forgery and would be packing our bags in a half an hour. We still haven't figured it out.
All right, let's stop right there. First, what does a nuclear physicist know about medieval relics? Or even, let's say it's not a medieval relic. Let's say it's from first century Judea. What does a nuclear physicist know about first century Jewish burial customs and burial shrouds? What is he doing there? He went for logistics, if you're curious, but why are we taking his opinion, his quote, as somehow evidence that this is authentic? And I'll tell you why. Because it fits Russ's narrative. That's why. And him saying that we haven't figured out what it is yet or how it was made yet, doesn't mean that it's the actual burial shroud of Jesus. Just because we don't know exactly how it was made doesn't mean it's a miracle. It doesn't mean it actually belonged to Jesus. It just could be that we don't know the specific exact method that the artist used yet. And there have been lots of speculations and recreations of the shroud. So there are attempts at figuring it out, but we can't be 100% sure about what they used. And that's okay. But it doesn't mean it's miraculous.
John Heller, one of the blood chemists and avowed agnostic, says this: I was convinced it was a forgery, but now there's no question in my mind that there was a scourged, crucified man in the shroud.
Funny thing about this, okay, I cannot find this quote. If you guys can find it, please share it with me, but I cannot find this exact quote. I don't know where he got it from. And John Heller was part of the project, yes, but he did not actually go with the group to Italy, which was what this guy went on for a few minutes about, like how they took all this equipment and everything. John Heller didn't even go with the team. He worked, I guess, in labs in the States or something. But that's a very interesting misrepresentation of the facts. And also, he's not agnostic. And he's framing this quote as, well, an agnostic believed this. And it was just so impressive that, it convinced an agnostic. And that's not what happened. Okay, he was not agnostic. This is just incredibly manipulative and disingenuous on Russ's part. And I honestly don't know how he can get away with sharing such blatantly obvious lies and misrepresentations at such an international and acclaimed level. Like, this is disgusting to me. But here's what I found about John Heller, though, and this is from Christianity Today, and it was published in 1983. Okay, it says, John H. Heller, Southern Baptist, agnostic, you say? Agnostic? No. Southern Baptist and biophysicist, does not particularly care whether the Shroud of Turin is the authentic burial garment of the crucified Christ. Quote, my belief in Christ is an article of faith, and I see no reason to extend that faith to a piece of cloth. It is not required. My respects to him and his understanding that it is faith and it's not based in evidence, but this is not what Russ is claiming here in his presentation. What Russ is doing with this presentation is spreading lies and misrepresentation, and it's disgusting.
In the official conclusion of the Shroud Project, written in 1981, all scientists are in agreement with this statement. We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human being, of a scourged, crucified man.
Great. So everyone who worked on the shroud thought it was a real person. Did they think it was specifically Jesus? No. That's not in the quote, but that's what you're implying, Russ. Again, he's using these quotes very slyly, very manipulatively. Manipulatively? Is that a word? I don't know. He's being manipulative about it. But interesting point. Do you know who didn't go with the group to Turin to work on the project? Art historians, archaeologists, textile historians, people who could actually speak to the artistic techniques and methods that were potentially used on this item, specifically in reference to the massively popular and lucrative relic creation in medieval times. All those people, they didn't go to work on the Shroud of Turin. Yet here is Russ claiming that we can prove that the shroud is not made by an artist, not made by human hands, based on claims from who? Not art historians, not artists, not textile historians. No. Based on claims from physicists, chemists, engineers, etc. People who know nothing about art history. For anyone interested, I listened to a lecture from Nicholas Peter Lee Allen, and he has very interesting insights into specifically the history behind medieval relics and how he thinks the Shroud of Turin was made. And it really aligns with the popularity of relics and everything. And I found that incredibly interesting. And I think it's something that Christians conveniently overlook or don't look into. And I think that would really talk to how the shroud was a relic and not the actual shroud of Jesus. But he specifically highlighted how much money the relics made for the churches. And something like the Shroud of Turin that had the full image of Jesus, allegedly, it would have made so much money for the church. And I did, actually. But that would have been someone to take with them to evaluate the shroud. But, I digress.
It is not the product of an artist. The bloodstains are composed of hemoglobin and give a positive test for serum albumin. Well, the plot certainly thickens now.
Yeah, about this. The tests that were done in late 70s concluded that it might be blood, but it doesn't have to be human blood. In fact, a recent issue in the Forensic Science International journal explains that the methods that they used in the 70s to identify these things in the blood, the methods that they used can result in reactions with many different species, the blood from different species, not just humans. So it could have been blood from, let's say, a pig or something like that. And that blood reacted to the methods that they used for identifying it, and they just assumed that it was human blood. The methods were not perfect that they used in the 70s, and Russ is treating them as if they are all conclusive. And this issue actually just came out in December 2025 talking about this. And yes, it came out before Russ gave this presentation. And no, I don't think he read it. I don't think he would, honestly, at this point, read anything that would contradict with his opinion and his view on the Shroud of Turin. I mean, he's been pushing it for decades. Why go against it? But it's very important to consider these articles that are coming out saying, hey, that investigation done in the 70s, it wasn't all inclusive. The methods were flawed. And we need to talk about this because these lies are being pushed, right? But keep this study in mind because we are going to come back to it.
And so here we see the backing cloth here. It's a much brighter cloth, and yet even this is 500 years old. Look, it's a standard 1-to-1 pattern weave.
So you accept that that cloth is 500 years old, but you don't accept the dating for the shroud itself. Okay, great.
And we see the shroud stitched to the backing cloth. But notice how this much heavily yellow, darker cloth here is a very distinctive 3-to-1 herringbone pattern weave. It's expensive and therefore rare. We don't find it a lot. But it also adds a lot of strength and durability, and maybe one of the reasons why the shroud has lasted as long as it has, simply because of the way that it was woven. But everything about the manufacture of the cloth is doable in first century using first century loom technology.
Okay, a lot to unpack here. Remember how I said that there were no textile historians that went with the team that worked on the shroud in the 70s? Yeah, if there would have been textile historians there, I would bet you a significant amount of money that they would have immediately called out that the textile was not from first century Judea. But did you catch what Russ tried to do? He said it was doable in the first century. Doable doesn't mean common or even probable. In fact, he specifically highlights that the shroud was expensive and rare, two things that were not expected in Jewish burials. In my, again, very brief research that I did about Jewish burial customs of the time, it emphasized modesty and simplicity in the cloths that they wrapped their dead in. Archaeological finds, which again we should have started with, but they include plain linen shrouds. They don't include these expensive, rare cloths. And if you're thinking, well, Joseph of Arimathea had money, then he would have wrapped Jesus in an expensive shroud. No, even those who had money for burials didn't use such decorative weaves. So yes, while it may have been doable, it's almost ridiculous to say that Jesus would have buried in such a luxurious garment, if he was properly buried at all, mind you.
Image of the man is a purely superficial phenomenon, affecting only the top 1 to 2 microfibers, not threads, microfibers. And so let me give you some, and let me just back up and just say, each thread is composed of about 200 microfibers. So that means that if this penetrates only the top 1 to 2 microfibers, then the image resides only on the top 1% of a single thread. The closer you get to the shroud, the less detail you see. To the point, if you get closer to the 6 feet, the image disappears. You can't see it. You see the bloodstains, but you can't see the image. But the closer you get to a painting, the more detail you see.
Yeah, so as an artist myself, I don't get this argument at all. The closer you get to a painting, the less you see of the big image. Yes, you're going to see details of a brushstroke, but you're not going to see the image. You're going to literally get up close and you can't see the big image. And same with the shroud. Up close, you don't see the big image. I mean, it's massive. What are you talking about? I don't understand how this argument holds up, to be honest.
We see some yellowing on the top 1 to 2 microfibers here. And the best chemistry we have is that something has caused the accelerated dehydration and oxidation of the cellulose fibers composing the linen cloth, but only in those areas immediately surrounding a body. So in other words, something has caused the discoloration of the cloth with something has interacted with the cellulose of the flax fibers, not because of any substances applied to the cloth as an alleged artist. The beginning of science really began over 100 years ago.
I literally cannot. I think it's absolutely fascinating what he's saying, that the color's only on the top 1 to 2 microfibers. Yes, that's very interesting. But I am at a loss for words. He completely rules out that any substance could have caused the oxidation and dehydration. That's ridiculous. How can you rule out literally thousands of different substances that could have been used? Just because we don't know the method doesn't mean that it didn't happen by human hands. And then to say that science didn't begin until 100 years ago is just a complete slap in the face to centuries of advancement and people like Da Vinci, who created inventions and incredible art in the Middle Ages. I mean, he's completely ruling out use of abnormal substances that aren't paints just because I don't even know. I feel like this is a very hard concept for us to grasp, but artists don't just use paint. They work with all types of mediums: photography, metal, charcoal, and yes, even blood. I mean, let's use Leonardo da Vinci as an example. You know, he was an artist from the Middle Ages, around when the Shroud was dated, and he used unconventional items in his art. They have allegedly found DNA in some of his pieces, and they've also found rare materials that he used that we don't fully know how he created his pieces. And so just because we don't fully understand his artistic process doesn't mean that it is the product of some miraculous event. And since we know of somebody like Da Vinci who was so innovative and revolutionary in his art methods, that means that it is completely possible that somebody like Da Vinci could have also done amazing things that we just don't know about. The shroud is incredible how it was done, yes, but that doesn't mean it is absolutely impossible to be done with human hands. Maybe someone just explored with techniques and materials that we aren't fully familiar with yet and produced the shroud. This is not completely out of the picture. And just because we don't understand how the process was made doesn't mean it didn't happen. Remember, Russ said that he was going to prove that it was not created by an artist. But what he has proven to me is that he doesn't understand about art. He doesn't understand that people can use unconventional materials. The only thing that he's mentioned is paint and brushstrokes. That's what he's proven to me, and a lack of an understanding of art history. But to imply that this was caused by a miracle from Jesus, he's just essentially appealing to ignorance here. Well, we don't know the exact method, so what's the logical conclusion? Jesus resurrected from the grave. That is an appeal to ignorance, and it's not doing what he set out to do, which is prove that it was not done by an artist. It's not doing that.
When the shroud was photographed for the very first time, the image on your left is the image as it appears to the natural eye, and it's kind of vague and blurry and indistinct. On your right, however, is the image as it appears in a photo negative, and there's a transformation here that takes place that should not logically take place.
Logically, it should not logically take place. Why? Because he says so.
Does the image appear so much clearer in the photo negative? The only explanation is that the image that's on the cloth itself, on your left here, must be a negative image to start with.
The only explanation?
Therefore, what shows up in a photo negative when you reverse the light values is a positive image. And then when you look at it in a full body image, I mean, that's remarkable. And that looks like an X-ray.
Yeah, I mean, it's impressive. It's interesting, of course, but no, it doesn't look like an X-ray. There's no internal anatomy. It's just shading on an image that our brain interprets in a certain way. What is actually happening with this photographic negative is that the original image is so faint and low contrast. And so when we invert the image, it's easier for our brains to see and fill in the details because it makes the details more clear. That's what's happening here. There's no only explanation here. That doesn't exist. But even if it does have to be in the photo negative, let's grant that. That still doesn't mean it was a miracle, because researchers have explored the possibility of rudimentary photography with elements available in the medieval times. Like, this isn't rocket science here. There are other possibilities that he is just completely overlooking. And again, I have to come back to Da Vinci. He was designing and inventing planes centuries before we actually had planes get off the ground. It is not crazy to think that there were some rudimentary photography processes going on. It's not crazy. It is extraordinary that could have been happening, but it's not completely improbable. And I think there would be a higher probability of that occurring than someone rising from the dead. Just saying. And I don't know, maybe instead of implying that people in the 1300s were idiots and shitty artists, and that the only possible explanation could be a resurrection, a miracle, let's potentially explore other options. Maybe another option could be that someone was experimenting with painting in the inverse.
Now, this is at the Brooks Institute in California, Santa Barbara. They were commissioned to do all the photography for the Shroud project. And what they're trying to determine is what parts of the body would be in direct contact with the cloth, what parts of the body would be separated, perhaps by a millimeter up to 4 centimeters, and the image is still there, except lighter. So the closer the cloth is to the body, the darker the image. The farther from the body, the lighter the image. So in other words, the shroud seems to contain distance information.
Imagine that. Distance information existing in art. Has this guy ever seen shading? I don't know. Like, there are other explanations for the shroud having distance information than that it was physically covering a dead person's face, and then that dead person let out light when it was miraculously risen from the grave. Like, there are other explanations that we could explore. Distance information isn't, I don't know, it's not that good of evidence. People shade, people make shadows. Like, it could have just been shaded to show that this was further away from the cloth and this was closer. This isn't a this isn't a crazy idea, Artists do this all the time.
What about the blood? Is it just paint, and or is it actual blood? Well, in fact, the blood stains test positive for 13 different blood components, including bile, bilirubin, serum albumin, hemoglobin, and others. In fact, now bilirubin is very interesting. Bilirubin is a breakdown component of the red blood cells that occurs during conditions of severe stress. And I think maybe crucifixion would qualify. Dr. Alan Adler, another one of the blood chemists, he says, the blood marks seen on the shroud are consistent with a contact transfer to the cloth of blood clot exudates that would have resulted from major wounds inflicted on a man who died upright as a result of crucifixion. What we see on the shroud is not painted blood. It's not blood put on there by an artist with a brush. Nor is it fresh blood, as if someone was just, sustained all these wounds and then immediately wrapped in a shroud. It's not what we see. What we see on the shroud is literally the exudates of wounds that are in the process already partially clotted.
While this sounds very compelling and interesting, it's still a misrepresentation of what the analysis actually found and what it can actually prove. High levels of bilirubin is not indicative of a crucifixion death, not even necessarily of a traumatic death. High levels of bilirubin can be present with any trauma, disease, or even post-mortem chemical changes. It's not exclusive to some kind of traumatic death. It can occur in traumatic deaths, yes, but the levels of bilirubin that he's talking about doesn't automatically mean that it was a traumatic death. For example, they could be in a body of someone who has liver disease, or just normal chemical breakdowns in a body after death. It's fairly normal. It does not mean that somebody died traumatically. We also, again, have to remember that the shroud has been contaminated for centuries. It has been handled for centuries. So to even claim that the bilirubin is directly a result from the crucifixion is quite honestly ludicrous. And again, let's go back to the article from the Forensic Science International Journal. It highlights that the analysis done in the 70s could not reliably quantify the amount of bilirubin that was on the shroud, nor were the scientists able to distinguish between actual stress-induced bilirubin and normal blood. This article again goes on to explain the limitations of those tests that they performed in the 70s, and it explains that there's no real reliable method that proves trauma-related chemistry in the blood. That doesn't exist. So all these claims that Russ is making that this is clearly from a crucified man, clearly from somebody who was killed standing upright, those are inflated claims. Those are false claims. They are not backed by the actual data. And I also think that he is preying on the ignorance of the audience members, people who probably don't even know what bilirubin is, and just throwing out these big scientific words and saying, well, this blue, 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 that nobody is going to know what it is, exists, and that the scientists said that it proves something, and the people are just going to eat it up because they don't know any better. And he's twisting the facts, preying on their ignorance to get them to believe that the shroud is actually the shroud of Jesus. And I think it's very manipulative and, yeah, gross. So now Russ is going to go point by point over what he's already talked about, and I'm going to go point by point on how he's wrong and how there could be other possible explanations for what is happening.
So it's superficial, penetrates only the top 2 microfibers.
Many different chemical reactions could have occurred to cause that. A great burst of light from a resurrection is not the only explanation here.
There's no directionality, such as with brushstrokes.
Not all artists use brushstrokes or even conventional materials.
There's no outline to the image.
And not all artists use outlines.
There's no cementing of the fibers as with paint. It's uniform in intensity, top to bottom, front to back. You think you need a piece of technology to do that?
No, you don't need technology to do that. There are many chemical and physical processes that could occur that only affect the top layers of the cloth.
There's no variations in density as with known artworks.
Again, not all art methods and techniques produce density variations.
There's no capillary action.
We could still consider chemical reactions, scorch marks, airborne particles. There are so many options just being overlooked here in his supposed explanation of proving everything it's not.
No evidence that any liquids were applied to bring forth the image.
We don't need liquid. Dry media also works. And also, just a reminder, as we mentioned, in John it says that 75 pounds of a spice mixture was put on Jesus' body. So, yeah, we should actually see some liquid on the shroud if the Bible is allegedly true, and if the shroud is true.
There's no paint binder present, nothing to bind any substance to the cloth.
And many oxidation and scorch-like processes also don't leave any binder on the material. We're not talking about the only possible explanation being a miracle. We have multiple other options that we're ignoring here.
It's a negative image with distance information encoded.
Again, shading exists, Russ. Shading exists.
It's blood from actual wounds.
Yeah, that's not proven. The 2025 report explained that there's no way to prove that that blood was caused from actual trauma wounds.
It's human male DNA. We found that out in 1995, analyzed the DNA from a blood particle from the back of the head, and very degraded. You can only determine that it's human male, and that's about it.
We can only determine that it's human male. Yeah, again, no, Russ, you're wrong. This article from 2025 that you should have read before doing this presentation, it says that there was actually both male and female DNA found on the shroud. The 1995 analysis that he is talking about didn't account for all of the centuries of handling, kissing the shroud, carrying it around, all of the contamination. The analysis didn't account for that, and so he's going off of very inconclusive and unreliable results and saying, well, it has to be male DNA. he doesn't give all the details that were also involved in the analysis. He just glosses over that. Has to be male DNA. That's what they said, even though other people proved it wrong already. Nope, it's male. Has to be Jesus. That's what we're doing here, and it's so misleading.
But it makes no sense if it's the work of an artist. I mean, could you imagine crafting a whole pattern of bloodstains and then trying to craft your image around that later? It would be ridiculous.
Actually, yes, I absolutely can imagine that. The idea of creating art and images from, splotches or brushstrokes, it's actually very common, and I would love to try it out. It's an art form. People do it. It's not this crazy idea.
No one would do it. I don't even think you could do it.
Just because you have no understanding of art, Russ, doesn't mean that it is impossible.
There's nothing similar before it, nothing similar after it.
There actually have been several people who have replicated the Shroud of Turin using a few different methods. For example, rudimentary photography and pigment rubbing. We have recreated the shroud. Perhaps not exactly as it was, but there have been similar things after it. Again, it being the work of an artist isn't impossible. It hasn't been ruled out. You haven't proven that it's not the work of an artist. You've just appealed to ignorance repeatedly. That's all you've done here, Russ.
But I got to tell you, folks, we got a problem.
Oh no.
And that problem is called carbon dating. And again, in 1988, they carbon dated the shroud and they said they sent a little sample off to 3 different labs, and they said it had a date range of 1260 to 1390. So I guess that's the end of this lecture.
Yes, actually, we should have started with this, and then we could have ended in about 2 minutes. There you go. Case closed. It was made in the medieval times.
They were supposed to cut at least 3 different samples from 3 different locations on the cloth. They didn't do that. So what did they do? I'm going to give you this is a general area of where they cut for carbon dating right in here. In fact, we know that the shroud was physically, manually held up exactly as you see here over 275 times from 1418 to 1694.
So I'm going to summarize what Russ was saying here because he was largely depending on images on the screen, but he essentially was showing pictures of the corner where they cut the sample from to do the carbon dating, and he was showing that in paintings, lots of people were grabbing on the corners to hold it up and display it.
If you were looking for the worst possible sample location, you would pick from one of those 2 outside corners, which of course is what they did.
And again, with this, he's downplaying the fact that the whole entire shroud has been contaminated by fire, by water, by people. The whole thing has been handled. You're not just going to say one corner is contaminated because paintings show that it was like that. So now we're again saying paintings are going to be accurate. I feel like that's a bit ironic, but the whole thing has been contaminating. They didn't just touch the corners, Huge portions in the middle have water stains, fire damage. The whole thing has been contaminated. And to even stretch it out and hang it like this, you would have to touch it. You have to handle it. You have to touch the middle. And I'm sure people have touched the face of Jesus, touched his body to venerate it. I mean, come on. It's not just that one corner that has been handled by people. And he's also downplaying the fact that it was sent to 3 labs. I don't know if you caught that. He did say it, but it was sent to 3 different labs. And all of them came back with the same dating, which was specifically from 1260 to 1390.
So now, with taking 1 sample instead of 3, you see, now 5th graders know that cutting 1 sample into 3 pieces is not the same as taking 3 different samples.
Well, this is condescending and rude while also misrepresenting the goal of the 3 samples in carbon dating. And that goal is to have 3 separate analyses, and that's why they send it to 3 separate labs. It would be ideal to take the samples from 3 different places on the shroud. Yeah, that would have been better, but the bigger issue is to send it to 3 different places to have it tested. So in case one place it didn't come out fully accurate or there was some error in the testing, you still have 2 other locations to compare it to. So you have 3 different datings, and then you can make a conclusion based on that. So yes, while they took 1 sample and cut it into 3 different pieces, it doesn't negate the fact that there were still 3 separate carbon datings. And I just have to point out that he is telling people to disregard the carbon dating because of a painting from somebody who has just shit on artists of that time for the past 45 minutes. Now we're going to take art seriously, and if a painting shows that a hand was on that corner, well, then that must be absolute truth. But this could never be a real thing from an artist because artists couldn't do that back then. But these artists are depicting the absolute truth, and they are completely representing what happened accurately. It's very ironic to me, you know?
And so now enter Ray Rogers, thermal chemist for the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He begins to suspect that there's something awry with that corner because there's some spectrographic data that was saying that there's something chemically different with it. So he obtains a thread sample from the main body of the shroud and compares it with a thread sample from the middle of the reserve sample. Remember, the sample was cut but not carbon dated, and he publishes in a peer-reviewed journal and says, "Oh, lo and behold, they're not the same."
I don't know if you heard that, but he said, remember, the sample is cut but not carbon dated. So he's just glossing over the fact that Ray Roger worked on loose threads, not the actual samples that were carbon dated. And then he's saying that the samples that were carbon dated were different from the actual shroud, even though he was not testing on the samples that were carbon dated. Are you following that?
But for some reason, there's cotton in that corner. And lastly, he finds the presence of starch to stiffen the threads to effect some kind of repair. So in other words, we have all the ingredients for some kind of a medieval reweave or some kind of a medieval repair.
Now, here's where a textile historian would have helped greatly and would have thrown this idea out the window right away. There are no confirmed large-scale medieval reweaving practices, let alone one that could trick 3 different carbon dating laboratories. I mean, that assumption that he's planting in people's brains is just so out there, so unsupported by what historians actually have for the medieval times. It's just, well, I have to make this work somehow, so we're just going to say that reweaving happened on a large scale, and that's what they did in the Shroud of Turin. That's what happened, when there's no evidence to back that. He's just jumping to conclusions with no evidence. And again, taking advantage of the fact that the people listening to him aren't going to go and look into the history behind textiles in medieval times. And also, the trace cotton that he found is not a sign of a full fabric replacement. Even if there was a repair that was done, it doesn't erase the bulk linen structure that was carbon dated. Because what he's trying to say is that in medieval times, they repaired the shroud and they did a reweave, so that's why they're getting dates from medieval times. But even if there was a repair, it wouldn't have been replacing the bulk of the shroud, which was what was carbon dated. They didn't carbon date the one singular cotton here that he's saying that was supposedly a reweave. They carbon dated the bulk of the fabric, and that dated to the 1300s. This is just a whole lot of purposeful misrepresentation of the tests that were done, a misunderstanding of textiles and textile history, and an invention of plausible solutions like massive reweaving during the medieval times that history doesn't support. And it's all done to somehow make the Shroud of Turin seem legit.
So now enter a new technology called wide-angle X-ray scattering. This was published in 2022, peer-reviewed journal.
Finally getting to the good stuff. I feel like this test in 2022 was what really brought the Shroud of Turin back into popularity and really convinced people again that this is the real Shroud of Jesus, because I don't really remember this being a topic when I was a Christian at all. So I think this more recent test is what really pushed it again on social media, on YouTube and everything.
And they determined this technique measures the amount of natural aging found in various types of fibers, and by analyzing the amount of natural aging, they can determine, based on comparison with other fabrics, how old the shroud is. And what we found is that there's far more aging in fibers from the shroud for it to be only to be 700 years old. In fact, the best sample that they found that best compares with the natural aging found with the shroud, that linen sample was excavated from Masada, Israel, circa first century.
First century. Now it's miraculously being dated to the first century. So, this test that was done in 2022, it measures the natural aging of linen cellulose by analyzing how the crystalline structures break down over time. It was done specifically to try and prove that the carbon dating test done in 1988 was inaccurate. However, in possibly one of the most ironic twists, the test that they did in 2022 can only be accurate in perfect preservation conditions. And the people who did this test admitted it themselves. Here's a quote from the article that they published. The experimental results are compatible with the hypothesis that the Shroud of Turin is a 2,000-year-old relic as supposed by Christian tradition under the condition that it was kept at suitable levels of average secular temperature. 20 to 22.5 degrees Celsius, and correlated relative humidity, 75 to 55%, for 13 centuries of unknown history, in addition to the 7 centuries of known history in Europe, to make the present result compatible with that of the 1988 radiocarbon test. The Shroud of Turin should have been conserved during its hypothetical 7 centuries of life at a secular room temperature very close to the maximum values registered on the Earth. Now, was the Shroud of Turin kept in a temperature-controlled area for 13 centuries? Of course not. It wasn't even kept in temperature-controlled conditions in the last 7 centuries that we know of because it was in a fucking fire. Of course, it's going to say an older date because things like fire can cause more rapid deconstruction. This is basic logic. I mean, I don't know how they can even use this test to say it dates the first century when it has been through a fire, extreme heat, and chemical reactions and things that would make something decompose. Like, of course it's dating older, of course. And Russ knows just how poorly kept the shroud was. Even in the 7 centuries that we know of its history, it was taken out all the time. It was displayed all the time. For centuries. It has never been perfectly conserved. And we're going to look into this in a couple minutes. He's going to talk about this, the supposed history before the 1300s, when we have documented history of when it was and where it was and how many people handled it. He's going to talk about what he thinks happened to it beforehand. And he's going to explain how it traveled. People stole it. It was taken places. People touched it. It was never perfectly conserved, not for the 700 years that we have of it documented, nor the alleged 1300 years before that. There's no way that this is perfectly conserved. There's no way that this test is accurate. Russ cannot be so stupid as to complain about the contamination of the shroud and where they took the sample because that area was contaminated, only to turn around and use a type of dating that depends on zero contamination to try and prove that this is the legit Shroud of Jesus. But here we are, confirmation bias at its best.
So now we're going to have to look a little bit more at the historical trail.
This is what I was talking about.
So what evidence is there to prove that the shroud existed prior to the alleged carbon date? But before we do, I'm going to tell you about the story about the legend of King Abgar.
We are going to talk about a legend. A legend when exploring the historical trail of an artifact. A legend. And yes, this story is considered a legend by historians about King Abgar and Jesus. So apparently legends are fact now. I mean, if you're going to believe in the resurrection, why not believe in this legend too? Yeah.
So he sends a messenger down to Jerusalem to find Jesus and ask if he could come back to Edessa and bring healing to him. And Jesus, no doubt, says, well, listen, I'd love to help, but I'm a little busy right now. And so he commits to send one of his followers later on, which ended up being the apostle Jude Thaddeus. And it's, and so Jude brings a cloth with a mysterious image on it back to Edessa. And Abgar is healed of leprosy. He becomes a believer, and so Jude stays there at Edessa for many years apparently, and evangelizes. But now, if anytime you see an icon image of Saint Jude, you'll see with a face image of Jesus on his chest, most likely. And this has to do with this Edessa story that occurred. And so this cloth with this mysterious image on it, it becomes known as the image of Edessa. And it is described as the true likeness of Christ, not made by human hands.
Can you tell what he's getting at here by bringing up this image of Edessa? He's going to say that was the Shroud of Turin. Yup. He's going to say they're one and the same, based on a fucking legend. A legend.
By 944, Edessa had fallen to Islam, and the Emperor Constantinople was concerned about the safety and the well-being of this most holy of all Christian relics, the true likeness.
He's explaining this painting here, by the way, in his presentation. And like I said with the painting where they're grabbing on the corners of the shroud, it's very ironic that he is basing his analysis of the historical trail on artwork while also trying to debunk artwork. So he's valuing some as truth and accurate depictions of what happened, while also downplaying artists of the time and saying that they were too shit at their job to produce something like the Shroud of Turin. Ironic.
So here's the big church in the background, the Hagia Sophia. Here is the general of the army. Here's the army. Here's the emperor. In between the general and the emperor is this third face image. And it's telling us that there's an image on this cloth. But wait a bit. This is not some small cloth. It's draped over the emperor's arm several times, all the way over the general's back. So it's a long linen cloth with the face at the center of it. Kind of what we see on the shroud.
And what is he using as proof? A painting. And a painting from an artist who clearly does not understand perception and size and distance and everything. And so in this painting, which is not accurate, we're going to take the part that the cloth is long and say that that's the Shroud of Turin. And if we use that logic, then the face that they painted, off the cloth is also literally a 3D image of Jesus on the cloth. I mean, this doesn't make any sense to me. We are just selectively applying logic here. We're going to completely ignore all the other traditions about the image of Edessa that say only face, only face, only face. It's the face of Jesus. It's a small cloth about this size. It's the face of Jesus. We're going to ignore all of those traditions to claim that the image of Edessa was actually a 14-foot long shroud because of this one painting that can't get perception and death correct. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And this is all being done to retroactively fit the Shroud of Turin into pre-medieval history. Great historical work, Russ. Good job.
And from this point on, from the rediscovery of this cloth in the early 6th century, all of your icon images of Jesus change.
So he backtracked a bit here. He started talking about early images of Jesus and how they were very different from what the image of Jesus is on the image of Edessa and also the Shroud of Turin, because, he thinks they're the same thing. And yes, the image of Jesus is similar in both of them. But he was comparing both of these images of Jesus, saying the earlier ones looked a certain way, and then the later ones after the image of Edessa came out looked a certain way. And he was using that to somehow prove that the Shroud of Turin was more accurate and that these early depictions were inaccurate. And that's kind of opposite of how historical analysis works. And I sat there scratching my head listening to this because it makes zero sense. Because the closer the artists were to Jesus' times, I would think the more accurate their depictions would have been. Not the other way around, that when things like the image of Edessa and everything made it to Europe and Christianity was really popular in Europe and they reinvented the image of Jesus. And now he's saying that Jesus, the medieval Jesus, the European Jesus, is the actual image of Jesus? I was at a loss of words, to be honest. And just from a very brief art history standpoint, the style of the Jesus in the Shroud of Turin and the image of Edessa and, all throughout the Middle Ages, yes, it looks very similar because they're using iconography to represent a cultural standardization of Jesus' appearance. The image of Jesus became standardized. That's what this is showing. It's not showing that the image used in medieval times and throughout Europe is the real likeness of Jesus. It just means that it became standardized and they're using iconography.
Because now the true likeness has been
True
revealed.
likeness.
And if you're an icon painter, you're not going to paint a picture of Jesus any way dissimilar to what has now become known as the true likeness. In fact, you're familiar with these. These images are all through the Orthodox. You go into a Greek Orthodox church or even an Eastern Rite Catholic church, and you see these kind of icon images of Jesus.
Again, I have to say, this is just such a ridiculous argument to me. Byzantine art showed a cultural standardization, not a real likeness. In fact, these images of Jesus that he's showing, the one on the shroud and the one on the image of Edessa, they look so much like a white medieval man from Europe. The facial structure, the nose, everything. Put it next to other medieval renderings and you'll see. And if you look at the image of Jesus, it specifically has features that reflected holiness in that time. Like long hair, larger eyes, elongated faces, the long nose. All of these were symbols of holiness. It doesn't mean that it was the actual true likeness of Jesus. Even if they said it was during that time, any art historian could have told you that no, this was iconography. They used these different ways of drawing the eyes, the face to show holiness. This is what the artist did. It's not that the artist wanted to paint the true likeness because it was a little literal face of Jesus, but that's what became standardized. And again, Russ, you really could have benefited from an art history lesson. Gotta say that.
Now, is there anything else that can corroborate this historical trail? Well, thank you for asking. Because there's a whole pattern of pollen all over the shroud, and pollen can determine where the shroud has been in its long history.
No, Russ. It cannot determine where the shroud has been. Again, Russ, you were just talking about how contaminated the shroud was and how they couldn't use the corners because they were so contaminated. And do you not think that so many people touching this shroud would have also brought pollen contamination? I mean, crazy idea, I know, but
In fact, Dr. Avinoam Danin, he's a leading botanist with the Hebrew University, written 7 books on the flowers of the Holy Land. His last and final book before he passed away is called Botany of the Shroud. This is what he said: using my database of more than 90,000 plant locations, the place that best fits the assemblage of the plant species whose images and often pollen grains have been identified on the shroud is 10 to 20 kilometers east and west of Jerusalem. That's pretty specific.
like I said, so much contamination. There is no way to determine such an exact location, especially considering the fact that the textile itself was not common in first century Judea. We seem to have not done research on that at all, actually. The pollen could have come from migrants coming to see the shroud, or maybe from moving the cloth around so much. I mean, there's so many different ways that pollen could have gotten on the textile. Contamination for centuries, It does not determine that the cloth originated in first century Judea. You can't make these claims based on pollen alone, even though it sounds really cool and really impressive. Logically speaking, it doesn't work. It doesn't hold up.
So they scanned the shroud with X-radiography and spectroscopy, and they found these little tiny particles of limestone all over the shroud. But it's not just any kind of limestone. It's called travertine aragonite limestone. It's the same kind of limestone common to the hills and tombs around Jerusalem. And so then they also found particles of calcite. Now, calcite is the common ingredient in road dirt, but it's an oxidized form of limestone. But they found this calcite at only 3 locations: on the nose, on the knees, and on the feet. And so, what would you expect from someone who walked in sandals and fell under the weight of the cross?
As his presentation went on, I just felt these claims getting more and more ridiculous. There's no way to prove that someone was carrying the cross and then wrapped in the shroud. that's a crazy jump for me. This is so overreaching. Okay, let's just put this into perspective, okay? Calcite, limestone, and travertine are found all over Europe and the Middle East. All over. This is not somehow unique to Jerusalem as he wants you to believe. And again, contamination. The shroud has been touched, kissed, carried, repaired, exposed to the elements, on display for centuries. That contamination alone essentially destroys any analysis of pollen and dust on the shroud because of the amount of contamination. And again, the location for that dust, it doesn't seem out of the ordinary for me. I mean, walking was the norm back then. Of course, you're going to find dust on the feet. Of course, you're going to find dust on the knees. You know, you probably squat down, kneel somewhere. This isn't out there for me. I don't know. You might touch the ground and then touch your face a bit, scratch your nose from the pollen and the dust out there. This would not be exclusive to somebody falling down under the weight of the cross. That is just leaping to a conclusion that doesn't even fit. Literally anyone could have dust in those 3 locations just from being outside so much, just from walking, just from existing. On top of that, the researcher who did this, Max Fry, I forget how to pronounce it, but he has been heavily criticized for his work. So just throwing that out there.
Well, let's get cynical for a minute.
Why couldn't we have been cynical for much longer than a minute? I think this presentation would have been a lot shorter if we had been cynical more.
Because, thousands of people were crucified. How do you know it's Jesus?
Yeah, how do you know?
Well, as I said at the very start, we don't have the DNA of Jesus to extract it and compare with anything we can find on the shroud. So it would be, I think, at least constructive then to at least compare the shroud with the gospel and see how well they line up or don't line up.
I was hoping that we would compare it to something else, some other historical document, not just the Gospels, because we already did that, right? We already did that. And of course it lined up somewhat because, the person who created the shroud probably referenced the Gospels to make it. But Russ then goes on for a very long time describing the injuries, the scourge marks on the body, the blood from the crown of thorns, the process of crucifixion, etc. And he went into all of those details, saying that it perfectly aligned with the Bible.
Everything about the shroud wound-wise is perfectly consistent with the gospel.
Yeah, duh. This guy is completely missing the fact that the relics in the medieval ages brought so much money to the churches. I mean, like massive funds. So if you're going to make a replica of the shroud that Jesus was supposedly wrapped in at his burial, of course you're going to want it to align with the Bible because that's the research that people had and that's the stories that people knew and heard about. So of course you're going to want it to line up. It's literally the only place that we get details about the crucifixion of Jesus. It's the only place we have the details that he was stabbed in the side and everything. So of course the artist or the creator of the shroud would make them line up. That makes sense. My question when looking at the shroud is actually, why are the wounds so perfect looking? Like, imagine a man who was brutally tortured and killed. I would expect the whole thing covered in wounds, the whole thing covered in blood. I would not expect to see a perfect face where you can see the nose, the cheeks, the hair. I would expect to see a face completely beat up. Perhaps not clear features. That's what I would expect. And I mean, even if you've watched a movie like The Passion of the Christ and you see Jesus' face, like it is messed up. That's what I would expect if this was actually a man who was tortured and crucified. I would not expect this perfect recreation with wound marks in the exact right places. It seems sus to me. It is too perfect for me to believe that it was actually a crucifixion victim.
Now, this is an Egyptian burial tunic. There's about 75 of these in the Museum of Cairo. They all date to about the 2nd century. And the common denominator of these burial tunics are large swirling stains of decomposition with the body decomposed through the cloth over the years. There are no stains of decomposition on the Shroud of Turin. So if there was a body in that cloth, it wasn't in there for very long. So what caused the image then? Is it the work of an artist? I'd like to meet him.
Yeah. You, me, and a bunch of other historians and artists.
Custom crucifixion, maybe. Maybe someone deliberately crucified someone during the Middle Ages to emulate and replicate what happened to Jesus.
Yeah, crucifixion wasn't practiced in medieval Europe, so that's highly unlikely. But I like the way you're thinking, Russ. We're thinking about other options. Good job.
Maybe, but as far as we know, corpses don't make images on linen shrouds. At best, they make smudges.
Yeah.
What about resurrection then? I mean, after all, if this is the burial shroud of Jesus, then we know something pretty spectacular happened on the third day.
How do we go from something logical, like an artist using a body double to replicate what happened to Jesus, to a fucking resurrection? We were on the right track. We were thinking logically. We had two reasonable guesses, even though one was historically improbable. But a resurrection, jumping from somewhat logical to boom, the miraculous, to the supernatural, to a phenomenon to have never been recorded, to have been proven. And we're doing all of this leaping only to explain art processes that are still unknown to us. This is a massive argument from ignorance.
And so, if you're going to ask the question of what happened to Jesus, you're going to have to answer it with other verses of Scripture.
Scripture is not the only source, Russ. We've been over this. Scripture is not the only source, nor is it a highly reliable one because it is filled with theological narratives.
So here's one right here, talking about the angel. His appearance was like lightning. His clothes were white as snow, brilliant, brilliant being of light. And then how is Jesus? He's described on an incident called the Mount of Transfiguration. This occurred about 6 months before Jesus was even crucified. And the story goes that Peter, James, and John are at the bottom of the hill.
Russ, what happened to CSI Jerusalem? What happened? We are using the miraculous events described in the Gospels as evidence somehow for another miraculous event? Like, is Thor real now? Is Thanos real because a comic book that has Thor in it says that Thanos is real, so both are real? Like, that's what we're essentially doing. This is the level of evidence that we're relying on now. We are using the same theologically and mythologically imbued gospels that talk about Jesus to also prove that Jesus resurrected. And I have to point out again that these Gospels were written by people who did not even know Jesus decades after the fact and who had a goal to make converts. The Gospels are not 100% historically reliable in that sense. We have to take everything they say critically and look at it critically to see if it is probable or not. We just can't take everything at face value because the authors had a purpose, they had a goal behind what they wanted to write, and it is theological. We have to consider that when reading the Gospels. We can't just say, well, transfiguration is in the Gospel, so it happened, it had light. Now, when Jesus resurrected, it also had light. Like, that's not evidence, guys.
And then how does he appear to Saul, who's rounding up these renegade Jewish believers in Jesus, putting them in jail? This is on the road to Damascus, and it says this: suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him.
Again, relying on miraculous events to prove other miraculous events. And also, this conversion story of Paul isn't even what he himself described. Paul did not describe his conversion experience like this, and even if he did, a vision is not evidence. If visions are evidence, then all religions are true. The rest of the presentation got very preachy, so I am not going to subject you to that. But I do want to share some of the ending with you because, yeah, it was out there, guys. And I just want to highlight that this was not at all a CSI Jerusalem. That was not ever the goal here. The goal here was a ploy to keep Christians thinking that their religion is true in an increasingly scientific age that brings forward evidence that it's not.
At the end of the day, I don't know if the shroud's authentic or not. I certainly can't possibly wrap my head around it being the work of a medieval artist. But here's what I know for sure. I know absolutely for sure that the message of the shroud is identical to the gospel. There is no difference.
Oh my gosh. The message of the shroud, as if the shroud had a message. If the shroud did have a message, the message was that it was meant to bring in more money for the church, as relics in medieval times did. That was the message. That was the goal. That was the point. Money. Most likely. That is my conclusion based on the evidence. It might not have been, but
And that message is very specific. It's past, present, and future. It's past because it brings us back to a historical event.
sorry, I have to stop. The three points is just so common in evangelical churches. You always have a list of 3 things to remember. 3 things. And here the message is 3 things: the past, present, and future. It's just it's a sermon.
And it's called the literal, physical resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. It's not a myth. It's not a fable. It's not a fairy tale. It is a historical event that occurred in time. And you don't need the shroud. You have the testimony of all the apostles who died as martyrs for that same exact testimony.
This is so not the point right now, but I just have to call this out. There is absolutely no contemporary evidence that all of the apostles died as martyrs, let alone for resurrection beliefs. That evidence doesn't exist, and even apologists have admitted that. There is precious little to support this idea, and it mostly stems from much later myths. And on top of that, martyrdom and testimony and dying for beliefs aren't evidence that an event like a miraculous resurrection is true. That's not evidence. Again, if that were the case, then all beliefs are equally true because people have convictions and die for them. That would make all religions true. And it doesn't. That's not evidence. Come on, Russ. I think you need a dictionary of what evidence is.
A transaction has occurred, a payment has been made on our behalf. So I got to thinking about this. You know, when you go to a store and you purchase anything, you give the money to the cashier. What does he or she always give you in return? Exactly, a receipt. And what is a receipt? A receipt is a record of the transaction. It's a proof of purchase. Everything that was paid to purchase our salvation is on the receipt, making it an itemized receipt, documenting everything that was paid. So what does it mean? It means this, that we have been purchased. We belong to Christ. We have a receipt stamped in blood. This is paid in full.
He is saying that the Shroud of Turin is a literal receipt from God because he purchased us with his death. Oh my gosh. In the presentation, I could barely keep it together. I was like, this is crazy. I mean, kudos for you for coming up with this idea that I totally would have bought as a Christian. But oh man, my husband and I got a good laugh out of this afterwards. Like, a receipt. A receipt. The shroud is a receipt. Receipts are detailed, accurate, dated. I have a receipt right here, and you know what it says? Actually, where is it? Right here. Has a date, April 6, 2026 at 10:40 a.m. Time specific and everything. It has an itemized list of everything you bought with details. Does the Shroud of Turin have this? Like, God, Almighty God, where's the date on the Shroud of Turin? Because people can't seem to get that right. So if this is your actual receipt, could you, I don't know, put a date on it? Because, Aldi can put a date on their receipts, but you, the Almighty God, can't put a date on it? Like, come on. Also, this is pretty detailed here. God, where are the details that align with your Gospels? Like, the strips of linen on the wrist, the chin, the angles that is in the book of John. Where are those details in the Shroud of Turin? Or what about the face? Why is the face not brutalized? I thought this was a incredibly torturous event that Jesus endured for us. He looks pretty serene there. I mean, where's the trauma that he went through? Why does it not actually look like a crucified victim? Also, why would you let your literal receipt of salvation be nearly destroyed in a fire, in water, and by centuries of exposure? Why would you allow that if this was your literal receipt of salvation? Why would you let your literal receipt of salvation be used to bring in money for a church when that is something that Jesus literally flipped tables over? Like, I have so many questions. If you're going to use this analogy, I mean, yeah, I have so many questions. Like, guys, this receipt that I have here is more detailed than an alleged all-powerful God made his alleged receipt for us. Yeah, again, that explanation, I would have eaten that up as a Christian, but man, is it over the top. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed my incredibly long rant about the Shroud of Turin. I'd love to hear what you guys think about this. And so please leave your questions and comments down below. This is a topic that I'm extremely interested in. I have to say, I'm not a historian, so all of my research is, surface level. I have not studied this in depth, but I'm very interested in it. So if you guys have more resources or more insights into things like textile history and everything, love to hear that. So please leave your thoughts and comments down below. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button so you know when I release my next video. And until then, question everything.